You think modern celebrities have scandals? Wait until you hear what medieval royalty and church leaders got away with behind closed doors. The Middle Ages weren't just about knights and castles. They were filled with corruption, forbidden relationships, and secrets so dark they make today's hidden. You think modern celebrities have scandals? Wait until you hear what medieval royalty and church leaders got away with behind closed doors. The Middle Ages weren't just about knights and castles. They were filled with corruption, forbidden relationships, and secrets so dark they make today's headlines look tame. What I'm about to reveal will completely change how you see medieval history. We're talking about nuns having secret affairs, kings engaging in behavior that would destroy careers today, and torture methods so brutal they continued for nearly 1,000 years. Stick around because the most shocking revelation is coming at the end. Let's start with the institution that was supposed to be pure and holy, the medieval church. You've been lied to about how sacred these religious communities really were. Behind monastery walls, chaos was the norm. Historical records show nuns romping and playing with boys, and having illegitimate children they tried desperately to hide. One investigation found that religious women were abandoning their vows left and right, engaging in relationships that would scandalize even modern audiences. But it gets worse. Priests weren't just breaking their vows, they were running entire side businesses. Some owned taverns where they gambled and drank with common criminals. Others kept mistresses openly, flaunting their relationships while preaching about moral purity to their congregations. The church knew about all of this but covered it up to protect their reputation and power. The corruption went straight to the top. Pope Benedict IX, who ruled in the 11th century, was accused of hosting orgies in the Vatican itself. His behavior was so outrageous that he was forced to abdicate, then tried to buy the papacy back multiple times. This man was supposed to be God's representative on earth, yet he lived like a medieval rock star gone completely off the rails. And here's something that will blow your mind. They actually put a dead pope on trial. Pope Formosus was dug up from his grave, dressed in papal robes, and put on trial for crimes he allegedly committed while alive. They propped up his rotting corpse in a chair and had a full legal proceeding. When they found him guilty, they cut off his fingers and threw his body in the river. This actually happened in medieval times. But the church scandals pale in comparison to what the royalty were doing. Medieval kings and queens made modern politicians look like saints. Take King John of England, the same guy from the Robin Hood stories. Historical accounts describe him as a paranoid tyrant who had his own nephew murdered when the boy became a threat to his throne. But that's not even the worst part. John was obsessed with his nobles' wives and daughters. He would demand that powerful lords send their female relatives to court, where he would force them into relationships. If they refused, he would destroy their families financially and politically. One chronicle mentions that he kept a collection of what we'd now call explicit portraits of noble women, which he used to blackmail their husbands into loyalty. The French court was even more depraved. King Louis XI was known for his bizarre paranoia and cruel punishments. He kept his enemies locked in tiny iron cages where they couldn't stand up or lie down properly. Some prisoners spent years in these contraptions, going completely insane from the torture. Louis would visit them regularly, not to show mercy, but to mock their suffering and extract confessions. Then there's the story that's been covered up for centuries. Queen Isabella of France, wife of Edward II, didn't just rebel against her husband, she orchestrated one of the most brutal royal murders in history. When Edward refused to give up his male lover Piers Gaveston, Isabella had Gaveston captured and executed in a way that was considered shocking, even by medieval standards. But that wasn't enough revenge for her. She later had her own husband killed in Berkeley Castle, using a method so gruesome that chroniclers were afraid to write about it directly. They only hinted that Edward II died from something being inserted into his body while he was held down by multiple men. The murder was designed to leave no external marks, making it look like natural causes. Isabella then ruled England through her young son, essentially becoming one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe through manipulation and violence. Speaking of violence, let's talk about medieval justice system. You think modern prisons are bad? Medieval torture was an art form, and it was completely legal. The devices they created were designed not just to extract confessions, but to inflict maximum suffering over the longest possible time. What I'm about to reveal will completely change how you see medieval history. We're talking about nuns having secret affairs, kings engaging in behavior that would destroy careers today, and torture methods so brutal they continued for nearly 1,000 years. Stick around because the most shocking revelation is coming at the end. Let's start with the institution that was supposed to be pure and holy, the medieval church. You've been lied to about how sacred these religious communities really were. Behind monastery walls, chaos was the norm. Historical records show nuns romping and playing with boys, and having illegitimate children they tried desperately to hide. One investigation found that religious women were abandoning their vows, left and right, engaging in relationships that would scandalize even modern audiences. But it gets worse. Priests weren't just breaking their vows, they were running entire side businesses. Some owned taverns where they gambled and drank with common criminals. Others kept mistresses openly, flaunting their relationships while preaching about moral purity to their congregations. The church knew about all of this, but covered it up to protect their reputation and power. The corruption went straight to the top. Pope Benedict XIX, who ruled in the 11th century, was accused of hosting orgies in the Vatican itself. His behavior was so outrageous that he was forced to abdicate, then tried to buy the papacy back multiple times. This man was supposed to be God's representative on earth, yet he lived like a medieval rock star gone completely off the rails. And here's something that will blow your mind. They actually put a dead pope on trial. Pope Formosus was dug up from his grave, dressed in papal robes, and put on trial for crimes he allegedly committed while alive. They propped up his rotting corpse in a chair and had a full legal proceeding. When they found him guilty, they cut off his fingers and threw his body in the river. This actually happened in medieval times, but the church scandals pale in comparison to what the royalty were doing. Medieval kings and queens made modern politicians look like saints. Take King John of England, the same guy from the Robin Hood stories. Historical accounts describe him as a paranoid tyrant who had his own nephew murdered when the boy became a threat to his throne. But that's not even the worst part. John was obsessed with his nobles' wives and daughters. He would demand that powerful lords send their female relatives to court, where he would force them into relationships. If they refused, he would destroy their families financially and politically. One chronicle mentions that he kept a collection of what we'd now call explicit portraits of noble women, which he used to blackmail their husbands into loyalty. The French court was even more depraved. King Louis XI was known for his bizarre paranoia and cruel punishments. He kept his enemies locked in tiny iron cages where they couldn't stand up or lie down properly. Some prisoners spent years in these contraptions, going completely insane from the torture. Louis would visit them regularly, not to show mercy, but to mock their suffering and extract confessions. Then there's the story that's been covered up for centuries. Queen Isabella of France, wife of Edward II, didn't just rebel against her husband, she orchestrated one of the most brutal royal murders in history. When Edward refused to give up his male lover, Piers Gaveston, Isabella had Gaveston captured and executed in a way that was considered shocking even by medieval standards. But that wasn't enough revenge for her.
She later had her own husband killed in Berkeley Castle, using a method so gruesome that chroniclers were afraid to write about it directly. They only hinted that Edward II died from something being inserted into his body while he was held down by multiple men. The murder was designed to leave no external marks, making it look like natural causes. Isabel then ruled England through her young son, essentially becoming one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe through manipulation and violence. Speaking of violence, let's talk about medieval justice system. You think modern prisons are bad? Medieval torture was an art form, and it was completely legal. The devices they created were designed not just to extract confessions, but to inflict maximum suffering over the longest possible time. The Iron Maiden wasn't just a quick death. Victims were placed inside, and the spikes were positioned to pierce non-vital organs first. They would suffer for hours or even days before finally succumbing. The Brazen Bull was even worse. Victims were locked inside a bronze bull that was then heated over a fire. Their screams would resonate through the bull, making it sound like the animal was roaring. But here's what's really disturbing. These weren't reserved for the worst criminals. People were tortured for crimes like stealing bread or speaking against the local lord. Women accused of adultery faced punishments that were essentially public humiliation combined with physical agony. The breaking wheel was used to slowly crush every bone in a person's body, while crowds gathered to watch and cheer. The medieval period also had a twisted relationship with public entertainment. What we consider horrific today was considered a fun family outing back then. Public executions drew massive crowds, with vendors selling food and drinks like it was a festival. People would travel for miles to watch someone get beheaded or burned alive. But tournaments weren't the noble competitions we imagine either. Knights regularly died in these events, and the crowds loved it. The more violent and bloody the combat, the more the audience cheered. Some tournaments were essentially legalized murder, where personal vendettas were settled under the guise of sport. The betting on these events was intense. Noble ladies would wager their jewelry on which knight would survive, while common folk bet their weekly wages. The gambling addiction was so severe that some families lost everything backing the wrong competitor in a single tournament. Now here's where it gets really dark. Medieval nobles didn't just hunt animals for sport, they hunted people. There are documented cases of lords organizing human hunts, where they would chase down peasants through forests, treating them like wild game. These weren't isolated incidents but organized events with rules and prizes. The most horrifying example comes from 14th century Hungary, where Countess Elizabeth Bathory took this to an extreme level. She believed that bathing in the blood of young women would keep her beautiful and young. Over several years she tortured and killed an estimated 650 girls, draining their blood for her twisted beauty treatments. When authorities finally investigated, they found rooms filled with tortured victims and evidence of her gruesome rituals. But perhaps the most shocking truth about medieval times is how these dark practices were not only accepted but celebrated. The very people we think of as noble and chivalrous were often the most brutal and corrupt. The songs and stories that praised their deeds were essentially propaganda designed to hide the reality of their crimes. Medieval love stories weren't romantic either. They were often about powerful men taking whatever they wanted. The concept of courtly love was created to make stalking and harassment sound poetic. Knights would obsess over married women, write them endless letters, and refuse to accept rejection. What we'd now call restraining order situations were turned into epic tales of devotion. The marriage arrangements were even worse. Noble families would promise their daughters to men while the girls were still children, sometimes as young as 7 years old. These betrothals were legally binding contracts, and breaking them could lead to war between families. The girls had no choice in the matter, and were essentially treated as property to be traded for political advantage. And here's something that will make you question everything you thought you knew about medieval women. Many of the most powerful women of the era gained their positions through violence and manipulation that would make modern crime bosses jealous. They had to be ruthless to survive in a world where showing weakness meant death. Take Lucrezia Borgia, whose family turned assassination into an art form. She was married 3 times, and all 3 husbands died under mysterious circumstances that directly benefited her family's political ambitions. Historical evidence suggests she personally administered poison to several of her enemies, using her position as a gracious hostess to eliminate threats during dinner parties. The reality is that medieval times were far more shocking, violent, and corrupt than any modern scandal you can imagine. The difference is that back then, these behaviors were not only tolerated but often celebrated as signs of strength and nobility. What we consider criminal today was just another Tuesday in medieval Europe. These aren't isolated incidents or exaggerated stories. They're documented historical facts that have been sanitized over time to create a more palatable version of the past. The medieval period was essentially a time when the most powerful people in society could get away with absolutely anything, and they took full advantage of that freedom. The next time someone tells you that people were more moral or honorable in the past, remember these stories. Medieval nobility makes modern celebrities and politicians look like choir boys in comparison. The only difference is that back then, there were no cameras, no social media, and no investigative journalists to expose what was really happening behind castle walls. But this is just the beginning. The deeper you dig into medieval history, the more disturbing secrets you uncover. There are stories of royal conspiracies, religious cover-ups, and crimes so heinous that chroniclers were afraid to record them fully. The rabbit hole of medieval corruption goes much deeper than what I've shared today. What shocked you the most about these medieval scandals? Do you think modern society is actually more corrupt, or are we just better at hiding it? Let me know in the comments, and make sure to subscribe because next week, we're diving into the conspiracy theories surrounding medieval secret societies that allegedly controlled entire kingdoms from the shadows. Trust me, you won't want to miss what I've uncovered about the real puppet masters of the Middle Ages. You think you know the truth about medieval times? Everything you've been taught is a lie. The Middle Ages weren't just about knights in shining armor and noble quests.
Behind the castle walls, beneath the cathedral floors, and within the monastery cells, secrets so dark and shocking were hidden that they would destroy everything you believe about this historical period. What I'm about to reveal will completely shatter your perception of medieval history. We're talking about secret societies that controlled entire kingdoms, forbidden knowledge that could get you burned alive, and conspiracies that shaped the course of human civilization. The church, the nobility, and the scholars weren't the noble figures you imagine. They were players in a game so twisted and dangerous that most people couldn't even comprehend its true scope. Stick around because the revelations I'm about to share will make you question everything you thought you knew about the past. This isn't just history, it's a conspiracy that spans centuries, involving some of the most powerful people who ever lived. And the most shocking part, some of these secret networks still exist today. Let's start with something that will blow your mind completely. You've heard of the Knights Templar, right? Those noble warrior monks who fought in the Crusades and protected pilgrims? That's the story they wanted you to believe. The reality is far more sinister and complex than any Hollywood movie could capture. The Knights Templar weren't just soldiers. They were the medieval world's first international banking network, and they had secrets that went far beyond what history books dare to tell you. Founded in 1119, ostensibly to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, the Templars quickly became something much more powerful and dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Here's what really happened. When the Templars established their headquarters on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, they weren't just setting up a military base. They were conducting excavations beneath Solomon's temple, searching for something specific. Historical accounts suggest they were looking for ancient artifacts and forbidden knowledge that had been hidden there for centuries.
What they found changed everything. According to suppressed medieval chronicles, the Templars discovered scrolls and artifacts that contained knowledge that directly contradicted Christian doctrine. Some historians believe they found evidence that Jesus Christ had descendants, information about ancient magical practices, and possibly even proof that the crucifixion story was fabricated or altered over time. But that's just the beginning. The Templars used this forbidden knowledge to build a network of power that stretched across Europe and beyond. They established their own laws, their own courts, and their own secret rituals that were completely independent of church authority. They answered to no king, no pope, and no earthly power. They had become a state within a state, a shadow government operating behind the scenes of medieval politics. The banking system they created was revolutionary and terrifying. The Templars invented the first international credit system, allowing people to deposit money in one country and withdraw it in another. This gave them access to information about trade routes, political movements, and economic conditions across the known world. They knew about wars before they started, about famines before they hit, and about political upheavals before they occurred. Think about the implications of this. The Templars had advanced knowledge of major historical events because they were often the ones orchestrating them. They would loan money to kings to finance wars, then loan money to their enemies to keep the conflicts going. They profited from both sides while gathering intelligence that made them the most informed organization in medieval Europe. But the most shocking revelation about the Templars involves their secret initiation rituals. When French King Philip IV ordered their arrest in 1307, the charges against them included heresy, blasphemy, and practices that were so disturbing that many of the accusations were kept secret for centuries. The Templars were accused of denying Christ, spitting on the cross, and worshipping a mysterious head called Baphomet. Here's what the historical records really show about these rituals. New initiates were brought into secret chambers beneath Templar properties, where they underwent ceremonies that completely inverted Christian symbolism. They were required to deny Jesus Christ 3 times, spit on a crucifix, and swear allegiance to mysterious masters whose identities were never revealed to lower-ranking members. The worship of Baphomet wasn't just idle heresy, it represented something far more significant. Baphomet was depicted as a hermaphroditic figure with both male and female characteristics, representing the alchemical principle of the union of opposites. This suggests that the Templars had incorporated ancient pagan and occult knowledge into their secret practices, knowledge that predated Christianity and originated from sources the Church considered demonic. But here's where it gets really disturbing. The Templars didn't just practice these rituals for shock value or rebellion against the Church. They believed this forbidden knowledge gave them actual power, the ability to influence events, control outcomes, and manipulate both spiritual and material forces. Whether you believe in such things or not, the Templars clearly believed their secret practices gave them advantages that explain their incredible success and influence. The arrest and suppression of the Templars in 1307 wasn't just about eliminating a troublesome religious order. King Philip IV and Pope Clement V were terrified that the Templars had become too powerful and that their secret knowledge posed a direct threat to the established order of Christian medieval society. The Templars knew too much, controlled too much, and had too much independence from traditional authority structures. During their trials, many Templars confessed under torture to the charges against them. But here's the crucial detail that most people don't know. Many of them later recanted their confessions, claiming that the charges were true and that they were proud of their practices. This suggests that even facing death, some Templars remained loyal to their secret beliefs and considered their forbidden knowledge more important than their lives. The last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Jacques de Molay, was burned alive in Paris in 1314. As the flames consumed him, witnesses reported that he called down a curse on both King Philip IV and Pope Clement V, declaring that they would join him in death within a year. Both men died within months of de Molay's execution, the king from unknown causes, and the pope from what appeared to be a sudden illness. But the story doesn't end there. Before their suppression, the Templars had time to hide their most valuable assets and most dangerous secrets. Historical evidence suggests that Templar ships left France before the arrests began, carrying treasures and documents to safe locations in Scotland, Portugal, and possibly the New World. Some researchers believe that Christopher Columbus had access to Templar navigation charts, and that his discovery of America was actually a planned expedition to establish new bases for Templar successors. The survival of Templar knowledge and influence can be traced through various secret societies that emerged in the centuries following their official suppression. The Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, and eventually groups like the Illuminati all claimed connections to Templar traditions and incorporated elements of their secret rituals and forbidden knowledge into their own practices. According to one theory, the Knights Templar became the Illuminati, a cabal that controls major world events. While this might sound like conspiracy theory nonsense, the historical connections are more substantial than most people realize. The organizational structure, the secret initiation rituals, the emphasis on hidden knowledge, and the goal of influencing political events from behind the scenes all show clear continuities between the Templars and later secret societies. But the Templars weren't the only group in medieval times that possessed forbidden knowledge and operated secret networks. Let's talk about the alchemists, the medieval scientists who were simultaneously respected and feared for their ability to manipulate matter and unlock the secrets of nature. Alchemy wasn't just primitive chemistry, as modern historians often claim. Medieval alchemists were involved in practices that combined science, magic, and philosophy in ways that challenged both religious and secular authority. Alchemists might be respected or revered as genuine scientists and divines, endowed with special knowledge and insight, be seen as heretics, meddling with forbidden knowledge, or be regarded as unscrupulous tricksters and frauds preying on the desires of greedy and gullible individuals. The most famous medieval alchemist, Nicolas Flamel, provides a perfect example of how these practitioners operated in the shadows of medieval society. Nicolas Flamel is a well-known alchemist, to the point where he had many pseudepigraphic imitators. Although the historical Flamel existed, the writings and legends assigned to him only appeared in 1612. The fact that legends about Flamel continued to circulate centuries after his death suggests that his work involved something far more significant than simple chemical experiments. Historical records indicate that Flamel was a relatively poor scribe and bookseller in Paris, who suddenly became incredibly wealthy in the late 14th century. The official explanation was that he had discovered the secret of transmuting base metals into gold, but the reality was probably far more complex and dangerous. Flamel claimed that his alchemical knowledge came from a mysterious book written by a Jewish scholar named Abramelins. This book allegedly contained the secrets of angelic magic and the formulas for creating not just gold, but also the elixir of life that could grant immortality. Flamel spent years trying to decode the book's cryptic symbols and instructions, eventually seeking help from Jewish scholars in Spain, who were expert in Kabbalah and other forbidden knowledge systems. What Flamel actually discovered was a network of secret knowledge that had been preserved by Jewish, Islamic, and pagan scholars throughout the early medieval period. This knowledge included advanced mathematics, astronomy, chemistry, and psychological techniques that were far ahead of their time. More importantly, it included methods for manipulating people and events through what we might now call psychological warfare and social engineering. The wealth that Flamel suddenly acquired didn't come from creating gold out of lead.
It came from using his knowledge to manipulate markets, predict political changes, and provide services to powerful patrons who needed information and influence that couldn't be obtained through conventional means. Like the Templars, Flamel had tapped into a system of hidden knowledge that gave him advantages that seemed magical to contemporary observers. Flamel's case illustrates a broader pattern in medieval Europe. The sacred craft was a secret craft. The goddess Isis instructs her son Horus, "Keep it a great secret, megalomusterian." The initiated were forbidden to divulge their knowledge. They could pass it on only to their legitimate sons and to those who were worthy. Alchemical knowledge was passed down through secret networks that operated independently of official institutions and maintained their own traditions of initiation and secrecy.
These networks weren't just academic or philosophical. They were deeply involved in the political and economic upheavals of medieval Europe. Alchemists served as advisors to kings, provided intelligence to merchants, and often played key roles in the rise and fall of noble families. Their laboratories weren't just places where they conducted chemical experiments. They were centers of espionage, political planning, and social manipulation. The Church's attitude toward alchemy was complex and contradictory. Although the Roman Inquisition did not consider alchemy worthy of outright prohibition, Tarrant delineates a conceptual shift within the Roman Church that resulted in the condemnation of alchemy as a heretical practice. This shift occurred because church authorities gradually realized that alchemical practices were connected to broader networks of forbidden knowledge that challenged Christian doctrine and church authority. Medieval alchemists didn't just study chemistry and metallurgy. They were also involved in astrology, necromancy, and other practices that the church considered demonic. Many alchemical texts included instructions for summoning and controlling spiritual entities, methods for predicting future events, and techniques for influencing people's thoughts and behaviors through what they called natural magic. The most dangerous aspect of medieval alchemy was its connection to ancient pagan traditions that predated Christianity. Alchemists studied texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, a legendary figure who was supposed to have lived in ancient Egypt and possessed complete knowledge of natural and supernatural forces. These hermetic texts contained ideas about the nature of reality, the structure of the universe, and the relationship between mind and matter that directly contradicted Christian teachings. In medieval stories, magic had a fantastical and fairy-like quality, while in the Renaissance, it became more complex and tied to the idea of hidden knowledge that could be explored through books and rituals. This transformation occurred because medieval alchemists and their successors had systematized magical practices and created coherent philosophical frameworks that made supernatural phenomena appear rational and scientific. The influence of these alchemical networks extended far beyond the laboratory. They provided the intellectual foundation for later scientific developments, but they also laid the groundwork for political and social movements that would eventually challenge the entire structure of medieval society. The emphasis on empirical observation, systematic experimentation, and individual investigation of natural phenomena created mindsets that were fundamentally incompatible with medieval authorities' demands for unquestioning obedience. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of medieval alchemical networks was their international character. A common idea in European alchemy in the medieval era was a metaphysical Homeric chain of wise men that linked heaven and earth, that included ancient pagan philosophers and other important historical figures. This chain of wise men represented a continuous tradition of secret knowledge that connected medieval European alchemists with scholars in the Islamic world, Jewish communities, and even surviving pagan traditions. This international network allowed for the exchange of ideas, techniques, and information that completely bypassed official channels of communication and education. Muslim alchemists in Spain were sharing discoveries with Christian scholars in France. Jewish Kabbalists were teaching techniques to Italian nobles, and all of them were incorporating elements from ancient Greek, Egyptian, and Persian sources that had been preserved despite centuries of religious persecution. The existence of these networks explains why certain types of knowledge seem to appear simultaneously in different parts of Europe, why certain technological and intellectual developments occurred much faster than they should have according to conventional historical models, and why so many medieval figures seem to possess information and capabilities that were far ahead of their time.
These secret networks also explain the pattern of persecution that followed many medieval scholars and innovators. It wasn't just that they challenged specific religious doctrines or political arrangements. They were connected to alternative systems of knowledge and power that posed fundamental threats to the established order of medieval society. Take the case of Roger Bacon, the 13th century English philosopher and scientist who made revolutionary contributions to optics, mathematics, and experimental method. Bacon's work was far too advanced for his time, and he faced constant suspicion and persecution from church authorities who suspected him of heretical practices. What they suspected was probably true. Bacon's writings contain coded references to secret sources of knowledge, mysterious teachers who provided him with information that wasn't available through conventional academic channels, and techniques for discovering natural laws that went far beyond what was taught in medieval universities. Bacon claimed that true knowledge came from three sources: authority, reason, and experience. But his emphasis on experience and experimentation was revolutionary in a medieval context where authority was supposed to be the primary source of truth. More importantly, Bacon's definition of experience included not just empirical observation but also spiritual practices and mystical techniques that allowed the investigator to gain direct insight into the nature of reality. This suggests that Bacon was connected to the same networks of secret knowledge that included the alchemists, the surviving Templars, and other groups that possessed information and techniques that were forbidden by official medieval institutions. His persecution and eventual imprisonment demonstrate what happened to people who became too open about their connections to these alternative knowledge systems. The pattern repeats throughout medieval history. Scholars, scientists, and philosophers who made significant contributions to human knowledge often faced persecution, exile, or death because their innovations were connected to broader networks of forbidden knowledge that threatened established authority structures. But these networks weren't just about preserving ancient wisdom or conducting scientific research. They were also involved in long-term political and social projects that aimed to fundamentally transform medieval society. The ultimate goal wasn't just to acquire knowledge or wealth, it was to create alternative forms of social organization that would replace the feudal system and the religious monopoly of medieval Christianity. This brings us to one of the most controversial and dangerous topics in medieval history: the existence of organized heretical movements that went far beyond simple religious dissent and represented coordinated efforts to overthrow the entire structure of medieval civilization. The Cathars, also known as the Albigensians, provide the most dramatic example of how these alternative networks could develop into full-scale challenges to medieval authority. The Cathar movement emerged in southern France in the 12th century and quickly spread throughout the region, creating what was essentially a parallel society with its own religious beliefs, social institutions, and political structures. The Cathars weren't just religious dissidents who disagreed with specific Catholic doctrines. They represented a completely different worldview that challenged the fundamental assumptions of medieval Christian civilization. Cathars believed that the material world was inherently evil, that the Catholic Church was a demonic institution, and that salvation could only be achieved through secret initiation rituals and ascetic practices that were completely independent of Christian sacraments. More importantly, Cathar communities developed economic and social arrangements that were far more egalitarian and democratic than anything that existed in mainstream medieval society. They practiced gender equality, rejected feudal hierarchies, and created educational and cultural institutions that preserved and transmitted knowledge that was forbidden by Catholic authorities. The Cathar Perfect, the fully initiated members of the movement, were required to undergo secret initiation ceremonies that involved receiving hidden knowledge about the true nature of reality, the secret history of the world, and techniques for achieving spiritual liberation. These ceremonies were remarkably similar to the initiation rituals practiced by other secret societies, suggesting connections to broader networks of forbidden knowledge. What made the Cathars particularly dangerous was their success in creating viable alternative communities that demonstrated that medieval society could be organized in fundamentally different ways. Cathar regions of southern France became centers of learning, commerce, and cultural development that rivaled or surpassed the achievements of Orthodox Christian territories. The response of medieval authorities was swift and brutal. Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade in 1208, authorizing the use of military force against Cathar communities, and offering the same spiritual rewards for killing heretics that were previously reserved for fighting Muslims in the Holy Land.
The Albigensian Crusade wasn't just a religious conflict. It was a war of extermination, aimed at completely destroying an alternative form of civilization that threatened the monopoly of church and feudal authorities. The famous massacre at Béziers in 1209, where crusaders killed virtually the entire population of the city, demonstrates the lengths to which medieval authorities would go to suppress movements that challenged their power. The papal legate who authorized the massacre reportedly said, "Kill them all, God will know his own," indicating that the church was willing to sacrifice innocent lives rather than risk the survival of heretical ideas and social arrangements. This wasn't religious zeal, it was calculated political terrorism, designed to prevent the spread of alternative social models. But the Cathars weren't completely destroyed. Historical evidence suggests that many Cathar perfect escaped the crusade and established new communities in other parts of Europe. Some fled to Italy, where they influenced the development of later heretical movements. Others may have reached Spain, where they contributed to the preservation of forbidden knowledge in Muslim and Jewish communities. Still others possibly traveled even further, carrying their ideas and practices to new territories where they could continue their work in secret. The survival of Cathar ideas and practices can be traced through various underground movements that emerged in the centuries following the Albigensian Crusade. The Free Spirit movement, the Brethren of the Common Life, and various mystical sects all showed influences that suggested connections to Cathar traditions and access to similar sources of forbidden knowledge. More significantly, many of the social and political ideas that would eventually challenge the feudal system and lead to the development of more democratic forms of government can be traced back to principles that were first articulated by heretical movements like the Cathars. The emphasis on individual spiritual authority, the rejection of hierarchical social structures, and the belief that knowledge and salvation should be available to all people regardless of their social status, were all ideas that originated in medieval heretical communities. This raises a disturbing possibility that most historians are reluctant to address directly. What if the major political and social transformations that occurred in later European history, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, and even the Enlightenment, weren't spontaneous developments that emerged from the natural evolution of medieval society? What if they were the result of long-term projects carried out by networks of secret societies that had been working for centuries to undermine and replace medieval civilization? The evidence for this interpretation is circumstantial but compelling. The timing of major historical changes, the patterns of knowledge transmission, the social and political connections between key figures, and the consistent appearance of similar ideas and symbols across different time periods and geographical locations all suggest the existence of coordinated efforts that went far beyond what conventional historical models can explain. Consider the development of Renaissance humanism, which is usually presented as a spontaneous rediscovery of classical learning that occurred when Greek scholars fled to Western Europe after the fall of Constantinople in 1450. But humanist ideas and classical texts were already circulating in Western Europe centuries before 1453, preserved and transmitted by networks that included Jewish scholars, Islamic philosophers, and Christian heretics who had maintained contact with Byzantine and other Eastern sources throughout the medieval period. The humanist emphasis on individual dignity, rational inquiry, and empirical investigation didn't emerge from nowhere. It was derived from philosophical traditions that had been preserved by the same networks that included the alchemists, the surviving Templars, and the descendants of various heretical movements. The Renaissance wasn't a rediscovery of classical learning, it was the public emergence of knowledge systems that had been transmitted through secret networks throughout the medieval period. Similarly, the Protestant Reformation, which is usually attributed to Martin Luther's spontaneous rebellion against Catholic corruption, was actually the culmination of centuries of underground theological and political work carried out by various heretical movements. Many of the key ideas of Protestant theology, the emphasis on individual interpretation of Scripture, the rejection of clerical authority, and the belief in salvation through personal faith, had been articulated by medieval heretics centuries before Luther posted his theses in Wittenberg. Luther himself had connections to networks of scholars and political figures who had been working for decades to create the conditions that would make a successful challenge to Catholic authority possible. The rapid spread of Protestant ideas, the coordination of political support, and the development of new religious institutions all suggest levels of organization and planning that went far beyond what a single monk could have achieved on his own. The same pattern appears in the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries.
The emergence of modern scientific method, with its emphasis on systematic observation, mathematical analysis, and experimental verification, is usually attributed to individual geniuses like Galileo, Kepler, and Newton, who made revolutionary discoveries through their own brilliance and hard work. But these figures were all connected to networks of scholars, patrons, and institutions that had been developing scientific knowledge and methods for centuries. The Royal Society of London, which became the premier scientific institution of the early modern period, was founded by individuals who had clear connections to alchemical networks, secret societies, and political movements that challenged traditional authority structures. Isaac Newton, who is often presented as the epitome of rational scientific thinking, was deeply involved in alchemical research, mystical theology, and political activities that were connected to various secret societies. His scientific work was inseparable from his involvement in these alternative knowledge networks, and his discoveries built directly on foundations that had been laid by centuries of underground research and experimentation.
The Enlightenment of the 18th century provides the most dramatic example of how these secret networks eventually succeeded in their long-term project of transforming European civilization. The Enlightenment wasn't a spontaneous intellectual movement that emerged from the natural development of human reason. It was the public emergence of ideas and social programs that had been developed over centuries by networks of secret societies. Their legacy, however, has endured and fuels many conspiracy theories. Weishaupt was accused falsely of helping to plot the French Revolution. The Illuminati have been fingered in recent events, such as the assassination of John F. Kennedy. While accusations against the Illuminati might be exaggerated, the historical connections between secret societies and major political transformations are well documented. The Illuminati, founded by Adam Weishaupt in 1776, represented the culmination of centuries of secret society development. The term Illuminati has been assumed by or applied to various groups of persons who claim to be unusually enlightened. The word, which has been used in this sense since the 15th century, is the plural of the Latin illuminati, revealed or enlightened. The use of this term since the 15th century indicates that the Illuminati were part of a much longer tradition of secret societies that claimed access to forbidden knowledge. Weishaupt's organization was explicitly designed to infiltrate and influence existing institutions, universities, governments, churches, and other centers of power, in order to gradually transform society according to Enlightenment principles. The Illuminati recruited members from the educated elite and trained them in techniques of persuasion, manipulation, and social engineering that would allow them to influence policy and public opinion without revealing their ultimate goals. The French Revolution provides the most dramatic example of how these techniques could be used to orchestrate major historical changes. The revolution wasn't a spontaneous uprising of oppressed peasants and bourgeois citizens. It was a carefully planned and executed operation that involved years of preparation, coordination, and manipulation by networks of secret societies. The key figures of the French Revolution, Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, Robespierre, and many others, were all connected to secret societies that had been working for decades to create the intellectual, political, and social conditions that would make a successful revolution possible. The ideas that justified the revolution had been developed in secret society meetings, the political strategies had been planned in advance, and the revolutionary institutions were modeled on organizational structures that had been tested in secret society contexts. The speed and coordination with which revolutionary changes occurred, the similarity of revolutionary developments in different parts of Europe, and the persistence of revolutionary ideologies, despite massive resistance from traditional authorities, all suggest levels of organization and planning that could only have been achieved by well-established networks with extensive resources and long-term strategic goals. But the French Revolution also demonstrates the dangers inherent in these secret networks and their projects. The revolutionary period wasn't just characterized by political and social transformation, it was also marked by unprecedented levels of violence, chaos, and social destruction. The same networks that had worked for centuries to overthrow the old order proved incapable of controlling the forces they had unleashed. The Terror of 1793 to 1794, during which thousands of people were executed for political crimes, shows what happens when secret networks attempt to implement their programs through force and intimidation, rather than gradual persuasion and infiltration.
The revolutionary government became as tyrannical and oppressive as the monarchical system it had replaced, and many of the revolution's original leaders were themselves executed as the movement spiraled out of control. This pattern of secret societies successfully undermining existing authority structures but then losing control of the forces they unleash appears repeatedly throughout modern history. The communist revolutions of the 19th and 20th centuries, the fascist movements of the early 20th century, and various other political upheavals all show similar characteristics: careful long-term preparation by secret networks, followed by rapid revolutionary changes that exceed the expectations and control of their original organizers. The lesson here is that secret societies and their forbidden knowledge networks are real historical forces that have shaped the development of Western civilization for centuries. They aren't just conspiracy theory fantasies or academic curiosities, they are actual organizations with real power that have succeeded in implementing major changes in political, social, and cultural arrangements. But they are also inherently unstable and dangerous institutions that tend to generate unintended consequences and lose control of the forces they attempt to manipulate. The same characteristics that make them effective at undermining existing authority structures, secrecy, compartmentalization, ideological commitment, and willingness to use deception and manipulation, also make them prone to internal conflicts, factional disputes, and eventual self-destruction. This brings us to the most important question about medieval secret societies and their modern successors. Do these networks still exist today? And if so, what are their current goals and activities? The answer is both yes and no. The specific organizations that existed in medieval times, the Knights Templar, the various alchemical networks, the heretical movements, no longer exist in their original forms, but the knowledge, traditions, and organizational structures they developed have been preserved and transmitted by successor organizations that continue their work in modified forms. Modern Freemasonry, for example, clearly derives from medieval craft guilds and secret societies, preserving many of their rituals, symbols, and organizational structures while adapting to contemporary social and political conditions. The emphasis on secret initiation ceremonies, gradual revelation of hidden knowledge, and mutual support among members all show direct continuities with medieval precedents. Similarly, various academic, scientific, and cultural institutions that emerged during the Enlightenment and continue to operate today were founded by individuals with clear connections to secret society networks and continue to promote agendas that were originally developed by these underground organizations. The challenge for modern researchers is that contemporary secret societies have learned from the mistakes of their medieval predecessors and have become much more sophisticated in their methods of maintaining secrecy and avoiding detection. Instead of operating as separate identifiable organizations that can be easily targeted by hostile authorities, they now function as informal networks that penetrate and influence existing institutions. Modern secret societies don't recruit members through dramatic initiation ceremonies in underground chambers. They identify potential allies among students at elite universities, junior members of prestigious professions, and rising figures in political and cultural institutions. Instead of requiring sworn oaths of loyalty to secret masters, they create webs of mutual obligation and shared interest that bind members together through more subtle but equally effective means. The goals of these modern networks have also evolved beyond the relatively simple objectives of their medieval predecessors. Instead of just seeking to overthrow specific religious or political systems, they now aim to reshape the fundamental structures of human consciousness and social organization on a global scale. The development of mass media, global communication systems, and international economic institutions has created opportunities for social engineering and psychological manipulation that medieval secret societies could never have imagined. The same techniques that were once used to influence small communities of initiates can now be applied to entire populations through carefully designed propaganda campaigns, educational programs, and cultural movements.
The persistence of certain symbols, ideas, and organizational structures across centuries of social and political change suggests that these networks have maintained remarkable continuity despite their adaptation to changing circumstances. The same philosophical principles that motivated medieval alchemists and heretical movements continue to appear in contemporary intellectual and political movements, often expressed in updated language but retaining their essential characteristics. This raises disturbing questions about the nature of historical development and social change. If major political and cultural transformations are actually the result of long-term projects carried out by secret networks, rather than spontaneous developments that emerge from natural social evolution, then what we think of as progress or modernization might actually be the implementation of agendas that were developed centuries ago by groups whose ultimate goals remain hidden from public scrutiny. The medieval period provides crucial insights into how these networks operate, because it was during this time that many of their fundamental strategies and organizational structures were developed. The techniques of secret initiation, compartmentalized knowledge transmission, gradual infiltration of existing institutions, and long-term strategic planning that characterize modern secret societies all have their origins in medieval precedents. But medieval examples also demonstrate the dangers and limitations of these approaches. The destruction of the Knights Templar, the suppression of various heretical movements, and the violence that accompanied later revolutionary changes all show that secret societies are vulnerable to exposure and that their projects often generate unintended consequences that spiral beyond their control. Understanding medieval secret societies and their methods is therefore essential for anyone who wants to comprehend the real forces that have shaped modern history and continue to influence contemporary political and social developments. The conventional historical narrative that presents major changes as the result of spontaneous social evolution or the actions of individual leaders obscures the role of organized networks that have worked for centuries to implement specific agendas. The evidence for the existence and influence of these networks is extensive and compelling, but it requires careful analysis and interpretation because much of it has been deliberately obscured or misrepresented by both the networks themselves and by historians who either lack access to relevant sources or are reluctant to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about the nature of historical development. Medieval chronicles, alchemical texts, legal records, and other primary sources contain abundant information about secret societies and their activities, but this information is often coded or disguised in ways that make it difficult for casual readers to recognize its significance. Similarly, modern academic histories often present sanitized versions of medieval developments that ignore or minimize evidence of secret society involvement. The key to understanding this hidden history is to recognize the patterns and connections that link different individuals, organizations, and events across time and space. The same symbols, ideas, and practices appear repeatedly in different contexts, suggesting the persistence of underground traditions that have maintained their essential characteristics despite changes in their surface manifestations. The ultimate significance of medieval secret societies extends far beyond their historical importance. They represent alternative approaches to knowledge, power, and social organization that continue to challenge conventional assumptions about human nature and social development. Whether one views them as enlightened reformers working to improve human civilization or as dangerous conspirators seeking to manipulate and control society, their influence on the course of history has been profound and lasting. The forbidden knowledge that these societies claim to possess wasn't just esoteric information about alchemy, magic, or ancient wisdom. It was practical understanding of how human psychology, social dynamics, and historical processes actually work. This knowledge gave them capabilities for prediction, manipulation, and control that seemed supernatural to contemporary observers but were actually based on sophisticated understanding of natural and social laws. The question that remains is whether this forbidden knowledge represents genuine insights into the nature of reality that have been suppressed by conventional authorities, or whether it is simply a collection of techniques for deception and manipulation that have been used by ambitious individuals and groups to gain power over others. The answer probably includes elements of both interpretations. Medieval secret societies undoubtedly preserved and developed genuine knowledge about natural phenomena, psychological processes, and social dynamics that was ahead of its time and threatened established interests. But they also used this knowledge in ways that were often manipulative and self-serving, prioritizing their own goals over the welfare of the broader society. The legacy of medieval secret societies continues to influence contemporary developments in ways that most people don't recognize or understand. The same networks that once operated from castle chambers and monastery cells now function through corporate boardrooms, university laboratories, and government agencies. The same techniques that were once used to influence medieval kings and popes are now applied to contemporary political leaders and public opinion. The difference is that modern secret networks have access to technologies and resources that make their capabilities far greater than anything their medieval predecessors could have imagined.
The potential for both positive and negative outcomes from their activities has increased dramatically, making it even more important to understand their methods and objectives. The study of medieval secret societies, therefore, isn't just an academic exercise in historical curiosity, it's essential preparation for understanding and responding to contemporary challenges that have their roots in centuries-old conflicts between different approaches to knowledge, power, and social organization.